Ma grande sœur, elle est quittée en Côte d'Ivoire pour venir au Mali ici. Donc, elle a commencé entreprise ici. Elle nous a appelés, nous sommes venus ici pour les aider. Jusqu'à aujourd'hui, à peu près 20 ans aujourd'hui, on est en train de faire la teinture ici. Au début, c'était 15 personnes. Et maintenant, à peu près 100 personnes. On a commencé au début petit à petit. Après, on est arrivé, on a entendu que Kafo Djigné donne les prêts aux gens. Donc, on allait chez Kafo Djigné pour demander le prêt. Ils nous ont donné 10 millions de prêts. On a commencé avec ça. Jusqu'à aujourd'hui, on a 150 millions.
Au Mali, plus précisément, dans la capitale, les défis pour les femmes dans le cadre de l'expansion de leurs activités ou le développement de leurs activités, ça c'est l'acquisition des financements, surtout des financements adaptés à leurs activités ou à leurs activités d'expansion ou d'agrandissement de leurs activités. Donc aujourd'hui, c'est ce plus grand défi que les femmes, à Bamako plus particulièrement, c'est le défi à relever pour les femmes.
Quand on a commencé avec Kafo Djigné, on est en train de travailler ensemble, on est grandi ensemble, on a construit. Il y a d'autres qui vivent avec nous ici. Si on a construit une maison ici pour les tapers, les teinturiers aussi. Donc il y a des teinturiers, on a donné, ils sont mariés ici. Donc ils vivent avec nous. S'ils sont malades, on nous soigne, on nous donne nourriture, on fait tout ensemble. On est devenus comme une famille.
Ce nouveau partenariat qui va être noué entre CAFO et la Banque européenne d'investissement va permettre de financer plusieurs activités, plusieurs associations, surtout des associations féminines. Ça va nous permettre aussi d'accompagner les jeunes qui sont à leur phase de démarrage et qui n'ont pas pour le moment accès à des financements pour pouvoir démarrer leur activité et qu'ils auront besoin peut-être de financement à long terme.
Grâce à la Banque européenne et CAFO, nos entreprises ont grandi jusqu'à aujourd'hui.
And last but not least, it is time for me to introduce our very last segment, entitled Crisis and Opportunity. Where do we go from here? 18 months after the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, how has the sector coped with this enormous challenge? What changes are temporary and what will endure? And are there opportunities still to seize to build resilience in the future? In this closing plenary, we've assembled a stellar cast of experts to discuss these questions and more. For a conversation on how we move to a post-COVID world that lives up to our claimed ideals, stay tuned, it's coming up next.
And indeed, welcome everyone to this closing plenary session of European Microfinance Week 2021, entitled Crisis and Opportunity. Where do we go from here? My name is Johanna Ryan, and I am Global Director of Impact at Vision Fund International, and I'm delighted to be your moderator today. Now, I'm speaking to you from the UK, so it's towards the middle of the afternoon, it's the end of the working week, and we're going to have a very informative session, but I hope that we'll be able to have some fun as well. So that means that I'd really like you to make active use of the comments, because I'm going to be asking questions of the audience as well. And as I say, because it's Friday, if you want to add a bit of humour, then please feel free. There will be a question and answer session, so post your questions as you think of them in the comments, and we'll get to that towards the end of our session. But let me now ask our panelists to introduce themselves. we have a cast of 5 stellar, was the word that was just used, 5 stellar panelists. And so may I ask you to briefly introduce yourself? And I'll start with you, Babak, if I may.
Well, thank you, everybody. My name is Babak Abbassadeh. I'm the president and CEO of Toronto Center for Global Leadership in Financial Supervision. And we've been a member of the microfinance platform since 2017. And we work both on financial stability and financial inclusion issues. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jessica?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Jessica Schicks, and after having been both a researcher and a practitioner in the microfinance industry, I am now an investor with BIO, the Belgian bilateral DFI.
Thank you. Apricot, over to you.
Hello, my name's Apricot and I work for Investing for Development CCAV. We've got the Luxembourg Microfinance and Development Fund on whose behalf I'm speaking today. We invest predominantly in smaller MFIs across the globe, and I work in risk and in impact management in the organisation.
Thanks very much. Stanley?
Hello and good afternoon to everyone. My name is Stanley. I'm the CEO of Musoni Microfinance, a technology-driven financial institution operating in Kenya. And good to be here with you.
Thank you, Stanley. And Maria, would you mind introducing yourself, please?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Maria May. I'm a member of the Gates Foundation's Financial Services for the Poor team. I look after the work that we do on increasing access and usage of digital financial services. Prior to coming to the Gates Foundation, I spent 8 years working at BRAC, primarily with the microfinance program in Bangladesh. Excited to be here.
Thanks, Maria. And I'm going to actually stick with you, Maria, to ask you to answer our first question. And that is, and also I'd like the audience to answer this question. And as I said, if you want to entertain us on a Friday afternoon, feel free. Because the first question is, what do you know now that you wish you'd known 2 years ago? Maria?
Yeah, this was a great question. I had to spend a lot of time thinking about it over the last week or so. I think 2 years ago, if you had told me kind of the level of explosion we would have seen in digital payments, I wouldn't have believed it. And in particular, I think the uptake of new users and the number of people with new financial accounts has been really historical in its level. And there's a few different reasons behind this. One of them being kind of the unprecedented level of cash transfers that governments distributed. By some estimates, it doubled in 2020 relative to 2019. And in many, many countries, governments started to look for digital channels to do this for the first time. And so, for example, we know that in Brazil, about 28 million people opened their first account during COVID. In Colombia, another 1 million. In places like Bangladesh, we saw the government working with employers to digitize wages and wage replacement during COVID. And so you suddenly had this real uptick in government-supported efforts to bring people into financial accounts, which then also led to a lot of regulatory changes, some temporary, some permanent, something we could come back to. So all this also then I think trickled down into people having a reason to try digital financial services. In some cases, it had to do with just the need to move money. And, you know, they used to do this physically, but now it's something that they were doing digitally because of lockdowns and things like that. And so, you know, the experience, the trust, et cetera, it's really a step change from where we were 2 years ago, where a number of people had very little motivation, say, to try digital services for the first time. And so when I think about what that means and what we could have done if we'd known that earlier, it's obviously very hard to digitize or to launch new digital products during a crisis. We saw a lot of MFIs try that and some had great success, but it was certainly more challenging than if we'd been prepared for that 2 years ago. And so that's something that I think had we had a better sense of the kind of the speed and the scale of the digitization we'd see, we probably would have had a lot more tools at our disposal in terms of how to work with our clients. Thank you. I think you're on mute, Johanna.
Jonah, you must have been on mute.
Come back to us. We need our moderator.
Okay, sorry, I got a note that the host had muted my mic. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So Stanley, over to you. What do you wish you'd known 2 years ago?
Well, I think 10 years ago, we knew that digitization of our processes was key to improving financial inclusion. But I can say this with confidence that we never knew digitization would be needed this much during times of distress, like we saw during COVID-19. So for us, digital financial services was more on improving our efficiencies as a financial institution and also improving customer experience from the front line. But when it became apparent that financial services, at least to the bottom of the pyramid, are actually essential services, then we realized that we would better have had this idea before COVID or 2 years to COVID. And we had to make some quick developments, just like Maria said, some that worked very well, others did not work well, to improve an already digital bank or digital institution in this country. So just to sum it up, I wish and we wish in Musoni that we knew our digitization would come in handy when a global pandemic strikes the likes of COVID-19.
Thank you very much, Stanley. And Jessica, can I ask that of you as well, please?
Yeah, I really second what Stanley and Maria have been saying. Looking at MFIs that have done well digitalizing and that really benefited from COVID as a push for their digital, that were those that were almost ready to launch something when the crisis hit. And then they just did it so much faster than they ever would have if the crisis hadn't been there. But for many others, they would just come to the realization that, oh man, we should be doing this much faster. But then it's obviously impossible, except for some quick fixes, to do digital overnight in the middle of a crisis. But as an investor, personally, what I wish I would have known is how resilient the microfinance sector would once again prove to be. It seemed to be such a different crisis, such a big crisis, hitting all geographies, hitting all types of microfinance institutions, hitting all types of clients, and investors got worried. And so many investors just completely stopped funding. And then luckily, many also didn't, but it was so difficult at that point of time. And we had to make so many difficult decisions of what clients to support, even they weren't meeting any of our standard criteria anymore, of what waivers to grant, of what emergency lines to extend. And now with hindsight, actually, it turned out that once again, microfinance has fared really, really well up to now. Like admittedly, that the crisis is not over, but this has just been an amazing exercise, I think, for investors to stand together and try out new tools of supporting institutions in crisis.
Yeah, you mentioned these rather surprising, in some cases, degree of resilience of financial service providers, and of course, one of the keys to that was the work done by the regulators and the supervisory bodies early on. So my second question then is to you, Babak. What do you wish that you had taught or you had trained regulators and supervisory bodies in order for them to be better prepared for this crisis?
Thank you very much. And I understand that we have an enviable spot of being with people before their evening beer, but I'll do my best here. First of all, it's very hard to get prepared for a once-in-a-century pandemic. It was a massive shock to the system. We're still in it. I mean, I was just reading today in the paper, Austria is going back into a full lockdown, and some of the other countries. If that's the case in Europe and low vaccination, and in developing countries, and the major distrust of government that we see now, 18 months or so later, you can just see how this pandemic has wreaked havoc. Fortunately for the financial sector, fortunately and unfortunately, if you go back to the Dutch tulip crisis of 1630s, sorry about the history lesson, there's been basically about a financial crisis 10 or 15 years somewhere in the globe. Some of them have been massively international. It's kind of rewarding to know that this time the fancy people in fancy suits playing around with their derivative dynamites did not cause the crisis at all. In fact, supervisors and regulators basically learning from the lessons of the 2008 global financial crisis, they were much more prepared. Lots of different buffers on credit and everything else, and they were actually part of the solution. So regulators, supervisors, their allies at the treasuries and central banks really provided a lot of backstop to the system and worked hard. One of the things that we learned in this crisis is that the origin of a financial crisis can really come from anywhere. It doesn't have to be in the financial system. It doesn't have to be in the broad economy. And maybe there's a silver lining here, because we're also finished COP26 this year. So we can see how climate change, climate risk could be another source of crisis in the financial sector down the line. So let's learn our lesson and not be fixated only on credit risk, leverage ratios, and all these fancy equations. The other things I wanted to mention here is that as a capacity building organization, we constantly do crisis planning, crisis testing, simulations. We've had about 120 of them since 2008, and they have helped various actors. So there was early disruption. People had to work from home. It increased pace of digitization. We helped the regulators, in fact, with funding support from Gates Foundation and one of our partners, DFI. We are intensifying our teaching of digital financial services courses for various supervisors using various platforms. So I see this as really a big opportunity. It's just too bad that COVID did disrupt a lot of things, and it's very hard to put the genie back in the bottle, but I think we've all been fairly resilient. Thank you.
Yeah, I love the optimism that comes out of that answer, Babak. And indeed, as the comments show here, that another thing that we've learned is that we don't actually have to travel quite as much as indeed I am sure that all the panelists in this session used to do, much more than anybody is doing now. I'd like to turn to representatives on this panel from the investment community. And my question to you, Apricot and Jessica, is that and this is generally, I'm moving away from the crisis now, but what would you want other sector players, and maybe especially financial service providers, to do better? And again, I mean, this is a general question. So Apricot, would you mind starting?
Yeah, I'm sorry, you've just told us to bring things a bit away from the COVID crisis, but I was going to say that as an investor, actually the crisis has of course been a very tough period, but as everyone has mentioned previously, we've seen incredible resilience from this period. And why have we seen such resilience? Well, you could say that it's down to the sector itself that we're working with and the resilience of the informal economy. But credit where it's due, the institutions that we have worked with have done an incredible job of managing the crisis. So when we think about what institutions could do better, I think first of all, we should do them credit for how they have managed this absolutely unprecedented and very challenging period. We've mentioned how digitalization has been taken on board during this period, how people have looked into new solutions, how people have been incredibly flexible. I think we should also say how well FSPs have done when it comes to client centricity and looking at what end users really needed. I remember speaking to a lot of our institutions during the crisis and hearing how many phone calls were going on with end clients, how many surveys were being conducted. And I think without this flexibility and without this client centricity, investors would not be in this actually relatively happy situation that they're finding themselves today. So before saying anything about what we could do to work better, I just wanted to drop that in. But where I think perhaps we FSPs could do more is perhaps between communication with creditors. What we noticed during the crisis was that some institutions were perhaps slightly reluctant to approach us Some started to do renegotiations with one creditor but hadn't discussed it with another. And I think this is an area that really perhaps needs working on in both directions. Discussions between microfinance investment vehicles and FSPs, I think, is crucial. Also in terms of the data that we collect, beginning to teach beginning to sort of listen and create more of a dialogue between investors and FSPs, I think would be a very, very beneficial outcome.
Thank you so much. And Jessica, the same question to you, please.
Yeah, thanks, Apricot. It's actually quite nice to listen to everything that's been said so far, because it makes it much more present what's been happening throughout those last 2 years, and it hasn't just been magic that was structurally there and we've been lucky to get to the crisis, but it's true. I mean, it's been such a complex building, of where every player had to play their part correctly for it to work out. And it's pretty amazing how well that really worked, and how regulators did what they had never done before, and MFIs did what they had never done before, and investors did what they had never done before, and somehow it all played together and it worked out. But to the question in terms of what other players could do better, it's always easy to tell the others what they should be doing better. But I have a short-term and a long-term answer. In the short term, I wish that financial service providers find their way back to growth. Obviously, it depends on the market and the COVID situation that's now still present in the various geographies. But I see that even after the peak of the crisis, many financial service providers struggle to get back to growth because their power is still so high, and because the risk of clients is still much higher than what they're used to. And because they don't know what to do about clients that want renewals, but that had a poor repayment performance in the middle of the crisis. And it's not easy to do this, but I think it's our task now to get back on a growth path, to be there for clients, even if that means shifting culture a little bit, taking more risk than what we used to do. And hopefully managing to do that without losing the good repayment culture that clients are used to in microfinance, and without over-indebting too many people. So that's the short term. And then in the long term, I think of that triptych of digitize, get more flexible, and think big. And so digital, I think if MFIs don't digitize carefully but courageously, they will just end up being pushed into a social niche that may not be sustainable. That's an option for the sector, but I think it's worth trying going for something bigger. And with digitalization, but also simply with rethinking and with coming out of a crisis, I think comes a lot of potential to be more flexible. So that means more flexible loan schedules. It means much more flexible internal processes. And it also means a much more flexible range of products. And all of this just more focused on what clients really need. And think big goes in that same direction. I think it's time for MFIs to leave behind that old goal of just doing sound credit on a manageable scale. We've done that for pretty long, but somehow something new is coming up. And I wish that MFIs will go much more for efficiency, for scale, for mergers, especially in very fragmented markets, but even international mergers, to have the capacity also to handle the challenges of digitalization that usually need a lot of funds and a lot of capacity, and for innovation. And all of that focused on the benefit that it's bringing to clients.
Thank you very much. So Stanley, I'm going to come to you next, but as a fellow practitioner, what I heard, or what we heard from both Apricot and from Jessica, was you've done a great job, which is wonderful to hear. Great to have that recognition. But could you be more courageous? Could you take bigger risks? Could you think bigger? Could you be more flexible? there's a lot there for us to think about, and we do think about that kind of thing all the time. But I'm going to give you the chance, Stanley, to actually ask the opposite question. What do you wish that the investment community would do better or differently?
Thank you. And I think I would recognize what the investment community has done and the way it responded to the COVID situation globally. We saw, a number of communications, joint communications from, a number of investors coming together to chat with or now to handle the situation collectively, and respond to requests from institutions like Musoni. I must admit, probably we were one of the very first institutions to approach our investors to discuss ways of getting support during COVID-19. And I'm fairly comfortable with the response that we were able to get over a period of time from these investors. Without them, definitely microfinance sector would have suffered significantly and would still be lagging behind from bouncing back into full action. There are lessons that we've drawn from COVID-19. Key lesson that I've taken away is the smaller you are, the more vulnerable you are, you remain. So you need institutions like Musoni need to grow their balance sheets, scale up, so that they can be able to absorb risks that emerge from situations like COVID-19. You cannot grow without support from investors, and therefore the need for all of us to put our efforts together and make institutions, to grow from a small, minute, institutions to a sizable institution that can be able to overcome such challenges. Lastly, it's difficult to see institutions just adopting digital financial services that were very useful to Musoni during this COVID-19 period. But investors can challenge and can support institutions to be digital savvy. Investing is one thing, but also being deliberate and driving the innovation agenda is another one. Our customers are very eager to adopt digital financial services. So institutions, together with their investors, with shareholders and lenders, should also make sure that this narrative is not dropped as we move towards a post-COVID-19 situation. Thank you, Joanna.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Stanley. We have to remember all of these lessons that we've learned, because it's so easy just to move forward and just forget what was happening a year ago because we were so busy doing what we were doing a year ago. Now, we are about halfway through, and I'm minded of what Babak said a few minutes ago, that we're standing between our audience and their Friday afternoon beer in some cases. So we're halfway through and we're going to do a poll. And I hope the poll is going to appear on your screen, but let me tell you what the question is, please. And it's this: to make the financial inclusion sector and last mile clients more resilient to a future crisis, what should be the one top priority for the sector to focus on? Now, the choices are: is it expansion of digital innovations, both on client side and on the institutional side? Increase in women's empowerment and gender equality? Is it to maintain or deepen outreach to the very poor? Promotion of good governance? Or is the focus, the primary focus, should it be on small and medium enterprise finance? So that's our poll. I haven't seen it come up on my screen, but that's probably because of where I am in this studio. But I hope that the audience has seen it, and please do vote. We'll come to the results at the end. Now, I would like this next question again to be answered by the members of the audience, please. And I will be asking some of our panelists to tell us their thoughts. But the question is this, and I'm asking you to be a bit imaginative. So, putting aside practicalities like money and resources, what would you want this sector to look like in 5 years? But as a best guess, what do you think it will look like in 5 years? So audience, please put your thinking caps on and let us know what you think. So Babak, may I please start with you?
Sure. By the way, Joanna, it's still coffee time out here, so you don't want me to have to start my beer right away. But on this question, I'm a little bit, it's not all optimism. There's a bit of a mixed reaction I have. One is pace of innovation in the financial sector, including digitization, is increasing rapidly. So that's really good for all the reasons that various folks talked about. It's about time we do more of that. But at the same time, and so this will significantly erase distances and reach the poor and the vulnerable, as you said, has the potential to increase gender equality, all the good stuff. Harnessing the advantages and innovations of mitigating this risk is imperative. I mean, us as regulators, or those who teach regulators and supervisors, we're also very much aware of various misconduct issues, consumer ripoffs, cybersecurity. The whole range of issues will take place that are harder to control, especially as more and more unregulated financial providers, whether they're big tech or whatever, or others, are getting into the mix. And it's all about meeting convenience. Now, there is a relationship between financial inclusion and financial stability. I talked about that at my session yesterday, but also it's an IMF study that the two really go hand in hand, and good supervision, good regulation is the connective tissue here. So I hope that takes some precedence. We talked about, you brought up corporate governance. Good governance is actually key. When you look at ESGs, we'll focus a lot on the E and the S, which we should, but without good governance, nothing really, no good decisions or no good risk management can happen. And that does not matter whether the entity is a large financial institution or a micro institution. And I like to see more digitization happening, but yes, I agree with the comment about being courageous about it, but also smart about it, right? Let's not give up everything just in the mad rush to digitization, but it would be great to reduce the gap. I think there's still about 1.8 billion people that are unbanked, and the majority of them are women. So any stride we can make in this area is best, but let's do it in a smart way. Let's make sure that we don't advocate for the regulatory-free environment here. Thank you.
Thanks, Babak. And Apricot, could you give us your thoughts about this? What do you think? What do you think it will look like, and what would you like it to look like?
Well, I think it's very interesting that this is a question that has probably been asked in panels on the microfinance industry for decades now. And each time there's probably been a comment that the industry is on the spur of large change, but essentially products in the majority of microfinance institutions haven't changed that much. That being said, I would say that we probably now are on the verge of real change happening, partly because of the catalyst of the crisis and the increasing pace of digitalization. This has probably left more room open and more of an open mind towards flexibility. And I think certainly as investors, we're noticing an increasing diversity of models coming to us when it comes from microfinance institutions, not only when it comes to sort of digitalized models, but also when it comes to micro asset leasing models. We're also noticing an increasingly variety of other types of loan products, particularly on the value chain. So what does this mean? Well, I think this diversity of products means that financial services providers have a chance to impact lives in a different way than has previously been done. One of our partner institutions, M-Copper in Kenya, has a very nice phrase that it uses. which is views its mission as being upgrading people's lives. And I'm quite interested in the different outcomes that can be caused by these innovations in financial service models. So what I'd like to see is these models increasing in outreach, increasing in diversification. And I think what will come is the challenge of how we measure and analyze these new models as they become increasingly prevalent, because they're not necessarily adapted to investors' old due diligence processes. They're not necessarily well adapted to some of the outcome metrics that we commonly use today. So I think how these diverse models will be adopted by the industry is a very interesting area for the coming 5 years, both looking at the risks that come from these new models. And I know Babak previously highlighted that digitalization both presents an opportunity, but also some challenges. But I think all these new models we're seeing can be viewed in that light too.
Yes, thank you. And there's a relevant comment in the chat as well about delivery channels. How on earth are these delivery channels going to emerge over the next, or as the commentator said, in the next 10 years? And Maria, may I ask for your thoughts on this matter, please?
Yeah, I mean, what I have always found most powerful about the microfinance industry is it's really one of the few in the world that was set up to serve low-income rural women. And I just think that like there's never been a time where it's more important to really think about what that means in the present context. And we look at what COVID has done in terms of school being closed and kids staying home, in terms of women working in the informal sector and missing out on a lot of government programs, women's small and micro businesses more likely to be shuttered or lose revenue than men. You know, women have a need for kind of thoughtful and intentional financial services in a way and a level of magnitude that's more than it was even a few years ago. And so I would love to see the microfinance sector really double down in terms of how they serve women and keep that spirit that really drove microfinance from its earliest days alive. Whether or not that happens, right, when we have all these other constraints, I think is the big question. And I think for me, digitization kind of gives us maybe two really important inflection points. I think the first, and my friends on the panel have all been referring to this in their comments, is who gains the value that comes from digitization? Is that captured entirely by the provider, or is that maybe shared between the provider and the client, you know, with the client given the majority of it? I think that's a really important question in terms of what happens next. And then I think the second one is what Lucia has put in the chat as well. Does digitization mean we cherry pick the best clients and we can serve certain people more easily? Or does it mean that it gives us a new tool to go beyond who we could include before and really kind of bring more people into financial services? And I think those are both kind of being written now, and hope that we're kind of up to the challenge of taking the higher road. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so very much indeed. And please do keep your comments coming. Please put your questions in the chat, because we are going to have time for questions to the panelists in a little bit. My next question is going to be to all of the panelists, and it's this. Given all that's happened in the last couple of years, what changes do you think are going to fizzle out, but what changes do you think will be more permanent? And I'm going to turn first of all to Maria, if I may.
Thought I might get a chance to breathe there, Johanna, but I guess not. So I guess, again, I think I've said this pretty consistently. I think digitization is here to stay. And so I think, you know, thinking about how providers use that in the way that they organize their services, how they think about their partnerships, et cetera, I think that's really important. I think that the question around how much flexibility there is from the wider ecosystem is one of the issues that could fizzle down, right? We could see a lot of, for example, regulators kind of going back to lower levels of risk tolerance. We could see kind of more competition evolving versus the cooperation. So those are some different categories where I think we're not sure what's going to happen. Hopefully they won't fizzle out, but certainly they're more at risk than some of the more permanent changes around digitization. Thank you.
Yeah, that's what I was also first thinking of. I mean, it's not new anymore. We've said digitalization so many times now in this session. But for me, it's one of, and the bigger one, of two extremes during COVID that will somehow end up finding a new balance. During COVID, I mean, some institutions weren't operating at all, then others exclusively digitally, and that's obviously not the balance that we want. And no, digital is not a goal in itself, and it is not always the right answer, and it depends on how you use it. Otherwise, it may not be good. But there will be a really important path to digital now, and that will be permanent. And it's our job all together to figure out what the right balance is between personal contact and between digital convenience and digital efficiency. And the answer will vary depending on markets, on client segments, on products, on so many things. And everyone has to figure it out step by step. And then I was thinking of one other extreme that COVID pushed us into that certainly wasn't good either, but that we probably learned something from and that we'll find a new balance with, and that's restructuring. Because the microfinance industry, we've been so poor at restructuring for such a long time. Even after the zero tolerance policy had long officially been abolished, we still didn't restructure. So now COVID had somehow pushed many financial service providers to restructure huge parts of their portfolio, or some even the whole portfolio due to lockdowns. And I think that's just a technical capability that many of us have now learned, and the fear of restructuring has been reduced quite a bit. So for customer protection purposes, it would be really nice if we could obviously reduce those portfolios a lot, but keep that capability for those clients that need it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Stanley, what are your thoughts on this, please?
Well, very quickly, Joanna, I think very soon COVID-19 will assume its rightful place in history, and people will move on under a new norm, of course. But 2 or 3 items will remain kind of permanent in our lives. One, financial services are really essential to the bottom of the pyramid and need to be provided in an innovative manner, digital services playing a critical role in that. The second item is non-financial services that you can probably not lay hands on, tangible hands on, are even more essential. Providing just finance and savings and credit isn't sufficient to our target population. And lastly, the narrative between impact and sustainability has to be revisited and looked at more keenly on which is more priority than the other. Thank you, and back to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, that balance between impact and sustainability, I mean, that's sort of something that I think I spend a great deal of time thinking about. And I would imagine that there have been conversations about that throughout European Microfinance Week this year. Thank you, Stanley. Babak.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say the comments that I've heard are very astute and cover the inclusive microfinance angle of it very well. I don't have much to add there. From a regulatory side, I think we're going to see more push towards subtech, regtech, a lot of issues that we deal with on the stability side, such as cross-border, cross-sectoral, rather than focusing on one. Some of the things I like to see in the sector, and your other experts may be in a better position to comment, is I haven't really heard or read a lot about stress testing or various things in the sector or by the actual players. And that is key. It has to happen because crises will happen again. I mean, that much we can be sure of. And I think, so that's actually very key. And I hope there'll be a greater recognition about the relationship between what makes the financial system as a whole stable and what makes the financial system very inclusive and provides a lot of access. Right now, these are two ships that are kind of passing each other in the middle of the night. It's a silo. I think is a very, very bad silo. Big business suits and Basel people don't understand what financial inclusion is or its promise. And a lot of financial inclusion people I talk to don't give it 2 seconds thought about the stability of the system, and they're interlinked. Some of the things that won't change from our perspective is a connected way of trying to deal with these issues that I just talked about is an approach to supervision of financial institution and microfinance institution called risk-based supervision. I believe it was Jessica who said this. A lot of it has to do with people, and supervision regulation at the end of the day really has to be a relationship business that will never change. And as I mentioned, focus on good, proper governance and other things need to happen all the time. And investing in capacity building is really a must, right? So I'd like to leave that with you. Thank you, bye. Oh, not bye. Thank you. I'm still here.
Sorry.
No,
yeah,
I'm
capacity building. I mean, of course, Babak, you have to say capacity building, but it's critical. It's absolutely critical. It's in a crisis. You need to know that you've got the right skills in the right place to do the right things. And capacity building is essential.
Yeah, you need a playbook, right? So I don't know if you heard me say that, but yeah.
Okay, and Apricot, would you like to give us your perspective?
Very interesting. There's not so much to add from what everyone else, from what the other speakers have been saying, but I noticed two thoughts that were brought up by Jessica. One of the first was on the improvements on restructuring in this industry. And I hope one of the things that's here to stay as a result of our improved knowledge of restructuring is actually what lay behind it, an increased spirit of collaboration, whether it is between the financial services providers and the lenders, or actually between the lenders themselves. So I hope that spirit of collaboration outlasts the crisis. And actually responding to Babak's comments, I would have thought that collaboration was one of the things that was at the heart of creating stability in this sector. The second comment is we've heard digitalization coming up a lot in this topic, and in this session. And I think that we ought to look at not just at digitalization, but perhaps a change that may be more permanent, which is openness to innovation more broadly. I hope it's not just the digitalization that has come out of the crisis, which is here to stay, but the openness to innovation. And I noticed that Amelia had actually asked a question in the chat on this regard, to some extent. The fact that we're getting more and more data as a result of digitalization, and it's coming from various directions, but there's a gap with organizations lacking capacity and not being able to use the data. I think what's interesting is that we are noticing more providers who are allowing us to see some of these trends. There's 60 decibels, which was an incredibly useful resource during the crisis, giving us, when the crisis first started, we didn't necessarily feel like we had much of an ear to the ground, and getting this data from 60 decibels was very, very useful for us. So I think seeing what providers are making and ensuring there's a good dialogue between the providers, the investors, financial services providers, to ensure there's a dialogue and these tools innovate in the right direction and are mutually beneficial is important. And actually, I sometimes think there's not enough dialogue between the investors and the FSPs in terms of why data is useful, what data is useful for us, what data is useful for them, and how this can reflect on outcomes. So I think this is a very good, digitalization is permitting us a very good door to entry for discussion on this topic. And I hope that we can build on this collaboration that's been seen in the crisis to develop tools that have begun to emerge during this period.
Lovely, thank you very much. I really like your expression, retain an openness to innovation. We simply must. Now, Stanley, I wonder if you could offer your perspective on that question that's posed in the chat about digitization enabling us to gather that much more data. From the perspective of an actual practitioner, what comments would you give to that question?
Thanks, Joanna, and a very relevant question to Musone business. Digitization has enabled us to collect data of our customers for a period of 10 years. And therefore, it makes it easy for us to make decisions on the customer needs remotely without necessarily having to engage them with boots on the ground. And that was very helpful during the pandemic, especially when the government deployed containment measures that limited free movement of people. But then collecting data is one thing. Being able to process and make a sound lending decision based on it with the right mix of relationship is another challenge that nearly every player in our midst will face. Now, the fortunate bit is we have had enough time to refine our business model, to connect our customers to other social platforms that enabled us to get in touch with them remotely in order to be able to back the decision that we are making out of the data that we are getting out of them in a much more sound manner. And we also learned that there needs to be significant improvement on this because our customers need a combination of both financial services that you can make out of data and non-financial services that needs to be provided over and beyond what the data shows. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Stanley, indeed. So please do keep on putting questions as they come to you in the chat. But I have one last question for our panel members, if I may. And this is, I hope, lighthearted, and perhaps audience members would like to contribute in the chat as well. But what piece of advice would you give your future self who is facing another crisis? And I'm going to put you on the spot, Jessica. Can you give us an idea of what advice you might give yourself?
Yeah, I don't know if that is the one best piece of advice, but after everything that we've been saying today, the first thing that comes to mind is to be bold. Not to follow the herd, but to think for myself, not to focus on the next few months, but to focus on the next decade, even in the middle of a crisis, actually, because it's when you're there, it just looks like a huge fire and you have to fight it so that you can finally go back to what was good and what was before. But actually, that would be the saddest thing ever. And like you say, never let a good crisis go to waste. It would be nice to have that presence of the mind in the middle of the crisis to already think about how we can benefit from it and what to make out of it so that something good comes out, actually.
Wonderful, thank you. Babak?
Sure. I think the most important thing is don't fight the last war. Keep plan ahead. Keep reviewing your crisis and stress testing. I hope people will have learned to do that. And think broadly about what the mission is and try to keep focused on that mission. People said many interesting things, my panelists here in this, and seems like there has been a lot of chance for them to reflect. So this only will serve us all well as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Babak. And Maria, how about you?
Great, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So I think one of the hardest things during the crisis, and Apricot alluded to this, was just the lack of data and just having like no clue what was going on because we were so far away. And so I think to myself in this, I would have said, trust the people who are closest and listen to them and do what you can to support them. Move fast because there's a big cost of inaction, which I think sometimes we don't think about as much. keep listening and collaborating. I think that was just fundamentally important. And so making time to really kind of build those networks and informal partnerships, and then to just keep adapting as we go, because the crisis itself continued to evolve. Thank you.
And indeed, thank you. And any last thoughts on that, I wonder, from our audience? And I'd like to point out some comments there in the chat. There's a link that's been shared there by Gil and Rafe. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Capability for restructuring is a very important lesson learned. Yes, couldn't agree more. And I would add, if I may, my own comments to that last question is to say that I wish that, or what I've learned is actually to speak out when something is wrong. Speak out, speak loudly, and don't shut up until you're satisfied that it's put right. So we are coming to the end of our session here, and I wonder from the host whether we have our poll results ready. Let me see. So once again, I'll just remind you what the poll was, is to make the financial inclusion sector and last mile clients more resilient to a future crisis. What should be the top priority focus for this sector? And let's see, I have not done a poll on this platform before, so I don't know what the results are yet. Let me have a look. It says, right, I'm sorry, I just can't see the polling results. So if somebody can jump in and announce them, then that would be very helpful. In the meantime, I am going to prepare to thank the panelists, unless somebody tells me they can jump in and tell us what the poll results were. Right, thank you very much. The top priority, as voted by the audience, is to maintain or deepen outreach to the very poor. So thank you very much for letting me know that. Now, I want to thank the audience very sincerely for your great participation. And I want to thank the panelists for your very, very thoughtful contributions. We've had some great suggestions that I'm taking away, whether it is to be bold, which is to retain an openness for innovation. And I forget who it was, either Stanley or Babak, who said, we're looking forward to when COVID-19 is relegated to its appropriate place in history. So this has been a fabulous session, and to Apricot, to Jessica, Maria, Babak and Stanley, and indeed to e-MFP, thank you very much indeed. And we will be handing over now for the closing remarks of the entire week. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Well done, Joanna, and our panelists. Thank you for such a strong end to our European Microfinance Week. And if Babak was nervous about being the last guy between the audience and their beer, think about how I feel. But as chairwoman of the European Microfinance Platform, it is always a privilege to be able to share the closing words of the conference, and another fantastic, strong conference it has been, which has included more than 500 participants, which is more than any in-person conference that we've done, and more than we've had last year. We've also had more than 50 sessions across a variety of topics, across a variety of formats, which we hope you enjoyed as well. We've learned a lot over the last year, as you have, about virtual networking and knowledge sharing. And so we hope you noticed some of the changes and adaptations that we've made compared to last year, and that has worked well for everybody along the way. It's true that a year ago, we didn't foresee really that we would be doing this in a hybrid, or in a virtual format rather. again, and perhaps you were a little bit disappointed to have to make that decision a few months ago that we would stick to the virtual format. But in the end, I'm very happy we did, as is the rest of the team, and as I'm sure you are, because it has allowed us to come together and not have to cancel our conference. And it has allowed us to be that much more inclusive. People who would not be able to travel to Luxembourg have been able to join the conference anyway. And so this is something that we'll try to keep, even if we're able to go back to some in-person next year, which, gosh, we hope we can. But there'll be a hybrid element going forward to enable as much participation as possible. So what a week full of very diverse topics, reflective just of how much the industry is still dealing with COVID or not, and also the fact that the industry and its different players are at very different places. Climate front and center, including one of the opening sessions. And of course, on the back of COP26, a key topic for our industry and a topic that we've been talking about for a few years, but keeps gaining in strength. And especially also thanks to the work of one of our action groups that has been very, very active in the topic and continues to drive it forward with aplomb. The action groups had some great sessions during the first day. And in fact, the last 2 years have seen an incredible amount of output throughout. Perhaps their experience working virtually together has served them well as well during this time. We've had topics in different languages. We've had topics on specific countries. Of course, healthcare was one very central topic to this conference because of the fact that our award this year was very much on financial inclusion and healthcare. And our heartfelt congratulations go out to Funkose again for winning this award. But a very strong appreciation also for the runners-up of this year's award and the other semifinalists, all of whom have had very interesting models, very diverse models, and models that you'll be able to look at in more detail also in some of our post-award reports. Impact measurement continues to be an important topic for us, COVID or not, and has seen increased sign-up and popularity again this year, as has, of course, financial inclusion for women, which we had 3 sessions on, including one with Daniela Konechko, who is the president of Fundación WWB Colombia, which is, of course, the opening keynote, and set us up well for next year's European Microfinance Award, which will be focused on financial inclusion for women. So the team, that's a very big topic, and the team will be getting some rest, but then working very hard at framing that topic and communicating to you very soon exactly what the award parameters will look like. You'll receive, of course, the conference report after in a few months, I think it will be, when you will be able to review the content, but especially you'll be able to see the videos of all of the sessions, except maybe 1 or 2, and which is another great advantage of our virtual format again. Once again, Joanna, what a wonderful and strong closing panel. Heartening because of the reminder of the resilience of our industry, of our beneficiaries, of our the actors, of all of you who have worked in it tirelessly over one challenge after the other. Encouraged also by the recognition of how well we've all done, or many have done throughout, but also the self-awareness, the encouragement to be courageous, the challenge to keep the learnings in mind, to not have wasted this crisis, to keep moving forward and to keep collaborating, whether that's through topics like restructuring that maybe don't sound quite as ugly as they used to, or whether that's to make sure that we keep women at the forefront of our work. One downside of our virtual format is that one big milestone maybe did not get quite as much attention as we would have liked or as it would have gotten in person, which is just to acknowledge that we are celebrating the 15-year anniversary of the European Microfinance Platform this year. And so when we hopefully meet in person next year, I will remind the team that some cake or other bubbles might be in order to mark this anniversary, even if with a little bit of a delay. And I hope and challenge all of us to still be collaborating and communicating and working together and in 15 years' time. So on that note, let me just go through a list of people to thank for this very successful week. First of all of you, thank you very much for joining us in numbers, but also very much in your live active participation. It is so appreciated. Everyone has been to many virtual conferences. You never quite know if everyone will show up, and boy, have you shown up. So thank you for that. Thank you to our sponsors who have continued to support both e-MFP and the European Microfinance Week. Thank you to our media partners as well for their continued efforts around raising awareness of the event. And thank you to all of our speakers. There have been many from many geographies, morning, noon, and night, who have contributed their time and their knowledge and expertise. Of course, Charles Mace and his team, who work tirelessly behind the scenes. They're the friendly voices on some of the technology aspects for those of us who have been speakers, and they appear and ensure that everything runs very, very smoothly. We know it's been some long days, nights, and weeks, and we're very impressed that you have pulled it off once again, and not only once again, but even better than last year. Thank you to my colleagues on the e-MFP board for your continuous support. And we remember fondly, of course, Sachin Vankalas, who we sadly lost last summer to COVID. But last and not least, a very big thank you to the e-MFP Secretariat. You have outdone yourselves. When we got to this point last year, we were waiting with the drinks in the wings, if you will, the virtual wings, because we weren't quite sure how it was all going to get pulled off. Well, it was fantastic then, and you've managed to do another fantastic run the second time round. And that is a very tall order. So thank you very much to the Secretariat for all of your hard work once again on this conference. So on that note, I wish you all to stay well, stay safe, stay in touch, and then see you next year. Thank you all very much.
All good things come to an end, and so it is too for the European Microfinance Week. Please note that the recordings of all the content during these past 3 days will be made available online shortly. So you'll be able to watch any of the sessions that you may have missed. We hope you've enjoyed the past 3 days. We hope that you have seen some familiar faces and connected with new people, and that you've worked with peers on shared topics of interest. Thank you all for joining and making EMW 2021 such a success. We will see you next year.